Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Hellbound, Hellraiser II. Now, Hellbound is the 1988 sequel to Clive Barker's 1987 horror classic Hellraiser, which was based on his book, The Hellbound Heart. Now, I'm gonna say right now that I really don't think Hellraiser is one of those movies that really needed sequels, and my problems with a lot of the sequels is as the sequels went on, they really started to become more like your generic slasher movies, which that wasn't what the first Hellraiser movie was at all, and I actually think the first Hellraiser movie is a pretty underrated movie because I feel like a lot of people don't really appreciate the first Hellraiser movie for what it is, and in my opinion, the first film is a very thought-provoking and actually a really unique horror film that, even today, you really don't see too many horror films quite like the first Hellraiser movie. But out of all the sequels to Hellraiser, this movie has to be the best one by far. I mean, because after this movie, not too many of the Hellraiser movies after this were really worth writing home about, so I really do think this movie has to be the best out of all the sequels to Hellraiser. Now, I am going to admit, when I first saw this movie, I didn't really like it very much, but over time, this movie has definitely grown on me, this movie for me is almost like a Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. When I first saw that movie, I didn't really care for it very much, but over the years, that movie has become one of my favorite Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, and it's almost the same with this movie. I didn't like it when I first saw it, but over the years, I've come to really appreciate this movie a lot more, and given how bad some of the Hellraiser sequels that followed this were, it's made me appreciate it, even more now. So the plot of Hellbound is it picks up where the first movie left off, and basically in this movie, Kirsty is now in a psychiatric hospital undergoing evaluation, and basically, she tells the police and the doctors at the hospital what happened to her, and she pretty much sums up everything that happened in the first movie, and of course I don't believe her, and what happens is it turns out that the psychiatric hospital is run by a doctor named Dr. Channard, and it turns out that he does believe her, and it turns out that he's obsessed with the occult, and basically what happens is now Julia, who is a character from the first movie, died in that movie, and of course she went to hell, and what happens is in this movie, Channard ends up summoning Julia from hell, he ends up bringing her back from hell, and she, of course, when she comes back to hell, physically manifests herself, and what happens is, of course, when she comes back from hell, she has no skin, and basically Channard is helping her become regenerated again, the same way Julia helped Frank become regenerated after he came back from hell in the first movie, and so what happens is eventually Julia becomes completely regenerated, and what happens is it turns out that Channard really wants to see hell, and he ends up taking this autistic girl who likes to solve puzzles from the hospital, and he gets her to open the box, and it of course opens the gates of hell. Now what happens is Kirsty, she ends up getting messages from what appears to be her father who died in the first movie, and it appears that after her father died, he went to hell, and now Kirsty actually wants to go to hell to try to save the soul of her father, and so what ends up happening is Kirsty ends up going to Channard's house, finding out what Channard is up to, and then Kirsty ends up going to hell, and pretty much the plot line is Kirsty, this autistic girl, Julia, and Channard are now in hell, and pretty much most of the movie takes place in hell, and basically when they're in hell, Kirsty ends up meeting Frank in hell, and And also, in this movie, you find out that hell was actually ruled over by an evil god called the Leviathan. And also in this movie, you find out the Cenobites' origins. It turns out that the Cenobites used to be humans. Like, all the Cenobites were people once who found the box and then were taken to hell and turned into demons. And, in fact, the movie begins with a little prologue where you see a man who, as it turns out, is the person who Pinhead was when he was a human, who solves the box, and you see him become Pinhead. But Hellbound Hellraiser 2 is a very, very interesting sequel. Like, what I like about it is it does definitely expand a lot more on the Hellraiser universe. Like, you see what hell looks like in this universe, and, and I like a lot of the ideas on hell. Like, in the movie, it turns out that when you go to hell, you're in your own personal hell, and, like, when Kirsty first goes to hell, you see her briefly in her own personal hell, but she manages to get out. But when she runs into Frank, he's in his own personal hell. I like that idea, and I like the idea of the Leviathan, which is the god that rules over hell. It doesn't really explain what exactly the Leviathan is, but you could assume that it's Satan in a way, or at least the Hellraiser universe version of Satan, because one thing that's interesting about the Hellraiser movies is it's debatable whether you would actually consider the hell in this universe to be the traditional Christian Judea hell, or if it's really just its own mythos. And what I like about the Hellraiser movies is they do leave it open for interpretation. Like, what I like about this movie also is the movie actually has some really, really disturbing images in it. Like, and also, and what I like about it also is, even though they focus a lot more on the Cenobites in this movie, the Cenobites are still not really the main villains of the movie. Really, in this movie, the main villains are Julia and Channard. Even though Channard does become a Cenobite at one point, really, the Cenobites are still very much, like, side characters. Like, in the first movie, it was really Frank who was the main villain, but, and that's something I really like, is the first two Hellraiser movies really do focus mostly on the human characters, and the Cenobites really are just side characters. But in this movie, they do focus on the Cenobites more and focus on the whole mythos of the Hellraiser universe a little. Now, I do have a few problems with the movie, but my problems with this movie are very, very minor. Like, really, they're just, like, nitpicks, really. Like, one problem I have with the movie is, now, in the first movie, Kirsty had a boyfriend who I will admit was a pretty useless character in that movie. I feel like they only put that character in there because I guess they felt like they had to give Kirsty some kind of love interest, even though he really didn't, like, contribute much to the first movie. But he lived in the first movie, and in this movie, they only briefly mention him, but they mention that they sent him home, which, to me, that's just, like, a big cop-out, because, like, I mean, even though he really wasn't much of a character in the first movie, still, I mean, he just had a supernatural experience with his girlfriend. You would think he would try to stay with her, and, like, and also, like, they send him home, but, like, in the movie, Channard mentions, oh, quite the adventure he thought he had, and it's just like, so you're saying that he said the same things that Kirsty said. Like, how come you're sending him home and leaving Kirsty there when they're both claiming they saw the same things? Like, that didn't really make much sense to me. But, and I have a few minor problems with the movie, which once again are just little nitpicks. Like, I do feel like this movie was kind of rushed, because this came out, like, only a year after the first one, but once again, that's just a minor critique, because I do feel like, even though it does seem a little rushed, I feel like they do try to give this movie their all, and I think it's a really good movie. Now, the film is written by Peter Atkins, who also wrote two more of the Hellraiser movies, and he would go on to write the first Wishmaster movie. But, yeah, that's my review on Hellbound Hellraiser 2, and bye.